Hi, everybody. This is Nikhil Vimal, and today I'm going to be interviewing the bot influencer, Chad Oda, creator of the Botpreneur Facebook community, founder of the, what is the podcast called again? Remind me quickly.
Yeah, so it's called the Bot Podcast.
It's called the Bot. Okay, good. I was making sure. And he does some stuff with he does work with agencies on bots. You recently gave a talk, I believe, on bots at the Bot Summit. If that's correct, we'll get to that as well. And you've been in the bot influencing space for a little bit now, and we're just gonna jump right in and ask you what got you into bots.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. That it's always interesting, like origin stories, right? No matter what technology, no matter what startup or vertical, it's always interesting, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like we sort of stumbled into chatbots. I think like many people did back around 2016. So for us at the time, we were sort of running a workflow automation-based consulting firm, and it's so funny because my co-founder at the time had read something about chatbots, and he was telling me. I remember that day he was telling me about it, and then we were just like, whoa, like you can like automate certain things on messaging channels, and you can really scale some of those interactions out. And so we were interested for like a couple of weeks after that. And then the funny thing was, so at the time we were prospecting for clients within the mid-market and enterprise space. We went to some design thinking meetup, and we met the director of innovation for this pretty large healthcare insurance company. So we ended up getting on a phone call with this guy because he was just interested in what we're doing as far as the consulting agency, and was trying to see if maybe there was some alignment with some of their initiatives. So on the call, he's telling us this case where right now at the time they were trying to scale out their customer support centers, because as they were just adding way more people in network, like they just couldn't feasibly continue to build out customer support centers, or it was just not financially a viable strategy for them at the time. So it was sort of funny. My co-founder and I were hearing this use case. We look at each other, we put the phone on mute, and we say, "Hey, we should pitch him chatbots. Yeah, we should pitch him chatbots. Go ahead, pitch this guy chatbots." And to our surprise, at the end of the call, this guy says, "Hey, this sounds great. I'd like you guys to come in and pitch to our senior level stakeholders." So my co-founder and I sort of look at each other like, "Oh shit. All right, we got to learn this chatbot thing." So, that was like sort of the initial salvos into the chatbot space, and that was actually a successful implementation. We ended up building some things internally for them. And, from there, that really got us our start.
Yeah.
And, from that, we've worked with robotics companies. We've worked with politicians. We work with insurance companies and healthcare companies and e-commerce companies and pretty much anything and everything across the spectrum.
That's awesome. And so to follow up that question a little bit, obviously you got into bots as sort of an agency owner, right? And so what sort of drew you into becoming an influencer, or like an evangelist and an influencer?
Sure.
Really involved yourself with the bot community and stuff like that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a great question. It's so funny because, so I'm actually sitting in a co-working space right now with a friend of mine who's working on some like personal branding stuff. Hey. Had that same question and discussion before I jumped on this podcast.
That's awesome.
So I did not plan on being an influencer. So how this all sort of culminated and got started was, so at the time, getting into bots, I realized, I'm not the smartest guy when it comes to bots, right? I'm still learning. I'm still trying to set up this ecosystem at the time. And this was, earlier, when we got into bots. And my thought process was, okay, well, how do I learn about this space and talk to some of the smartest people that are working on cool implementations with bots or voice? So what I thought was, okay, I'm going to start a podcast, right? Because not only can I like raise visibility amongst best practices and insights and strategies just to benefit the community. Also, maybe a little more selfishly, I knew that, I can sort of talk to these people too and sort of figure out what's the lay of the land here, like what's working, what's not working. And sort of through that, it sort of inevitably created a platform for me to get the opportunity to talk more about chatbots and talk more about voice user interfaces. And from there, the podcast then sort of extended to some of the video content I've started to do on LinkedIn. which to my surprise, people actually wanted to listen to what I had to say about some chatbot and voice stuff. And then from there, that really lent itself to giving me opportunities to speak at Chatbot Summit and to work with Yoav Burrell, who's been running, one of the top conferences in the world right now. It was recently in Berlin, and also be speaking at Business of Bots next February in San Francisco, actually. So, I never sort of intended, on being an influencer, but I certainly sort of ended up sort of in the space. But, my whole objective and mission from like a thought leadership perspective is really to try and surface what is tangible, what's viable, what's feasible versus all the noise, right? Because I think in any emergent technology, there's a significant amount of noise. And I think, the ecosystem as a whole can progress and evolve much faster if everyone has an idea of what's working, what's not working, so we can all sort of get back to work and solve the hard problems.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's a fantastic answer. Like it's interesting because I think you hear a lot of people who sort of get into influencing because they want to, right? But your story is a little bit more like, that's really cool to hear that you just sort of got into it and took a leap sort of to get into that. So it's great. It's great. And so the next question then, as an influencer, as someone who's been in the bot space, how do you think bots are going to change the world? Pretty interesting question, pretty big question, but just your opinion and your perspective. How do you think they'll change the world?
Sure. So my vision when it comes to bots, I think we need to sort of focus on, really what is the paradigm shift at hand here? Mm-hmm. For the longest time, humans interacting with computer systems, has always been sort of this like artificial experience, right? If you think about back to, computers that took punch cards, right? Then moving to command line interfaces, then moving to graphical user interfaces on a desktop, and then moving to mobile interfaces. And then finally, provided the, economics behind storage, compute, and networking becoming accessible, these platforms have now taken center stage where conversational user interfaces are now viable for startups and for enterprises alike. And that being said, if we think about what the potential that exists, right? The potential really is, the friction and intuitiveness for humans to interact with any computer system is much, much better, right? So the way that, let's say, a 70-year-old would interact with a conversational user experience, a 4-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 26-year-old can interact in that very same approach. So where do we get from there, right? What we get is the interfaces necessarily like mobile phones or desktop computers or voice interfaces, the interfaces or the platforms themselves don't really become that important anymore, right? So it doesn't matter what device it is, I can still interact and sort of get the computer to sort of do or help me or sort of computate whatever I'm trying to actually do. I think that's sort of the end vision where we have this vision of sort of ambient computing, right? Almost you begin to take it for granted, such as, water, electricity. When we walk into a place, we don't, sort of think to ourselves, is there going to be light? Is there going to be, electricity? We just know it's going to be there and we know it's going to work. And I think that's where we're going with conversational user interfaces. And I think within the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to be living in a very different world that, I think right now might be sort of hard to wrap our heads around.
Sure. We saw that initial hype phase, I think starting maybe even 2015, I'd say it started pretty early with like Slack jumping on this whole thing of like bots are going to be the future of our platform. Obviously Facebook at F8, it went, I think the crowd kind of went wild, or at least the press media went wild when they saw that there was going to be this huge centralized bot platform. Finally, even though I think the talk's been around for quite a while, of conversational interfaces, but we saw these big players sort of jump in and have now sort of, I don't want to say gone silent, but have sort of plateaued in their like level of excitement perhaps for it. So I think that's, it's super cool to continue seeing that there's people who, really believe, I personally believe that there's so much more left to do in that space, but with hype cycles, it's kind of it's a weirder process to follow. So I think we're coming up in exciting times though. And I think that's within 5 years, definitely, I think we'll see some really cool stuff. So, talking a little bit about, the concept of the bot community really, or actually, well, let's do another question first, and then I'll get back into that. But what do you think about the future of bots now, specifically towards certain sectors? So let's talk about the future of bots within the consumer space right now. What do you see maybe in that next 5 years? Where do you see consumers picking up on bots?
Yeah, so you're talking more from sort of a perspective of like B2C oriented brands, or
I'd say so.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think, I believe if we look at sort of the trends, right, and the trend really starts with messaging, right, messaging as a channel, right. So think about messaging as a channel, and the fact that the top messaging solutions have more monthly active users than pretty much the top social networking platforms, right? So I think, first of all, that begins to sort of indicate a directionality for like how consumers want to interact, right? They want instant, real-time communication and feedback 24/7, 7 days a week, right? They're already doing it with their friends, family, coworkers on these messaging channels. So, in that same sort of way of thinking, in that same frame, people also are beginning to want to interact directly with companies, right? They want to have that same experience. And if we just sort of follow that trend and we see that becoming sort of reality, if we think about, Apple Business Talk, and we see everything going on with Facebook Messenger in conjunction with small businesses and large businesses alike, as well as WhatsApp opening up their API, and, a number of other channels that are sort of consumer oriented, I certainly think there's a lot of upside. We're beginning to see those things work very well right now. For example, there's a company called Shop Message. Now they essentially provide a commerce chatbot service for one specific sort of consumer-facing use case, which is cart abandonment. Now they've driven $100 million in revenue with their clients on that platform. So we're already begin to see some tangibility from a consumer-facing side of things, but so that's the near term, right? People are still trying to figure things out. They want to find turnkey solutions. Best practices are still bubbling up, whether it's an e-commerce perspective or whether it's, maybe like a service-oriented brand or a product-based brand that's B2C oriented. But I think in the long term, what we will see is that conversational user interfaces become one of the primary touch points for consumers to interact with. So Gartner, I think they recently had put out a prediction, and they said 80% of sort of interaction with brands by 2020 would be facilitated without a human. So I think, that just sort of paints the picture of where we're going.
For sure.
Sort of imagine a world where that is the case. We can sort of imagine like something like, we're just interacting with a voice user interface, right? It's like, hey, I'm looking to, buy a new car, right? And, now there's like some sort of like switchboard where now that's connecting me to maybe a variety of different, car resellers or something like that. And now it can sort of take me down that process or that sales process, right? And, there's probably going to be a variety of different bots, but there's probably going to be like one virtual assistant that's going to surface all those capabilities.
Yeah.
And I think the other component to that too is, not only are we going to see compartmentalized use cases when it comes to conversational user interfaces, we're also going to be seeing enterprises, leveraging sort of the full value-added suite of services, their back end, and sort of connecting that, the initial touch point would be some sort of conversational user interface. So not to ramble on too long, but I always like to give...
No problem. It's a good answer.
So if we think about, let's just think of like a department store, right? Now, a department store on the back end, probably has, a variety of different initiatives in order to, increase revenue, increase, the retention of customers. So if we just think for a moment of the back end of a department store, for example, one of their initiatives is probably some sort of like digital transformation, for them, it's trying to figure out, where are they putting these legacy applications or new applications on the cloud or whatnot, right? So that's one component. And then moving from there, now we're talking about, let's integrate, a lot of the systems that they already have, marketing automation, ERP solutions, CRM solutions, right? So we have that data being shared amongst, those different platforms. Now that we have that, now we can already begin to see some patterns emerge, right? Now from there, there are things like, you can get access to sort of supercomputing,
Sure.
From a variety of different cloud vendors at this point. So now that we have the capabilities to actually like crunch a lot of this data, right? Yeah. Now we have some sort of analytics, predictive analysis, prescriptive analysis, potential to really surface a lot of that information, right? And now within the department store, now you probably want some additional data points, right? So maybe you can use an IoT solution to authenticate, people that have made previous purchases and to track all that in real time, right? For example, backend solution is also connected to their POS solution, and we also know if they were on the website looking at a pair of shoes, right? So now if we have all those data points and we have the capabilities to process that data and surface patterns for specific customers, now let's imagine like what that experience may be like if I were to walk into that department store. Let's say, for example, I was looking at a pair of shoes, online. I was looking at a pair of Cole Haan shoes online, right? They know who I am, they know my buying patterns. And then let's say, the next day I want to go into this department store and actually take a look at them. So provided all of that, I walk into the department store, maybe I get authenticated somehow through some sort of like, IoT device or sensor, near the Cole Haan shoes. So now I'm authenticated. And now what could happen is we can leverage all those value-added capabilities and then me on a conversational user interface, a custom offering for the exact pair of shoes that I want. So we can see that these conversational user interfaces can surface a lot of value-added investment by these companies to create really compelling, very targeted, very personalized experiences. But just my humble opinion, and sort of the way that I like to think about, okay, where can we get? Where can we get as far as some sort of unique experience down the line?
Right. Yeah, that's actually. I was reading. Funny you mentioned that. I was reading somebody. I forgot already on Medium though. I just saw a passing article about the future of chat, the potential future of chatbots right in the store. And there was some talk about like maybe like Snapchat getting into something like that, like having these, like you take a picture and a conversational interface could help you, or a messaging app like Facebook. But that's it's cool to hear that a lot of other people are thinking about that as well. Because I personally, that's another thing that I think this could be really big. And so, yeah, definitely. So yeah, I think you already sort of touched upon it a little bit in your answer there, but I want to also ask about your thoughts about like B2B, and maybe the proper term is like enterprise as well, because it doesn't necessarily need to be B2B, but like,
sure.
Yeah, what do you think is the future of chatbots in that space?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting topic. I guess I'll preface this by saying, in the near term, these are the top use cases I think have a lot of upside right now, right? Sure. We already talked about one of them, which is sort of consumer-facing, sort of marketing-oriented chatbot use cases. Mm-hmm. Use case is customer support.
Yep.
I think we've seen a lot of validation in that specific use case. 100%. Third use case that I think you're talking about specifically, and there are like different components to this, but are line of business internal facing chatbots.
Yeah.
And I certainly think there's a lot of upside as far as automating workflows internally. So that's one component. Now the other component could be sort of external facing B2B marketing, right? We see companies like Drift, and we see companies like now I can't even remember what their competitor is called. I think it's called Intercom. That's
yeah, that's right. They just announced that recently.
Right, and then I think even companies like the company that you represent as well. I certainly think there's a strong use case for B2B. But really, the use cases we're seeing, like from an external facing B2B perspective, tends to be sort of lead qualification, lead triaging, customer support. But I think there's also that compelling use case internally with sort of line of business applications. And the reason why I think it's so compelling right now is because, we think about how the paradigm is also shifting internally inside of companies, right? Yeah. I think gone are the days of only using email as a way to communicate internally inside of organizations, or, communicating with customers potentially, or other strategic partners. So that's why we see a lot of these companies adopting things like Microsoft Teams, Slack, and the availability with that is, okay, well, it's another messaging channel. Can we surface some sort of application or capability on those channels to automate some sort of work? as triaging HR requests or resetting a password or, helping me, fulfill my expense reports.
Yeah.
I think there's just, and I think we should make the comparison too that companies, around the world have invested hundreds of millions of dollars of building applications, mobile apps for these very use cases.
Yeah, now, exactly.
For whatever reason, we can say that it is some sort of slowdown right now in people downloading apps, which is sort of a fact at this point, or a number of other reasons as far as like why they're not as highly adopted, right? But then when we see messaging, it's just like everyone's already using messaging. It's our brain. All the time. There's an extension of utility beyond just talking to people, and that's where we're seeing these line of business applications really show the potential there. So I think that's a good start, right? But then I think even moving past that, the same example, similar to the same example I gave for consumer-facing use case, right? I think we're going to see a lot more voice user interfaces present in offices as well. And that same way we're leveraging the entire value chain and, predictive analytics or prescriptive analytics or, however else we're trying to figure out how we can augment that experience. I think we're certainly going to see that take place. And, it's actually funny that you asked me this question because I was sitting in on a presentation last night from Suhas Uliar, who is the VP of Bots, AI, and Mobile Product Management at Oracle. And, he was actually demoing for us a chatbot that he had built for him for his sort of internal needs in regards to, he does a lot of trips, and he was showing us this bot that, pretty much helps him schedule trips. He can surface, Yelp in there too. So if he's looking for a restaurant, he can also access the expense reporting bot. So when he goes to the restaurant, he can just take a picture of the receipt. So I think there's quite a lot of potential and a lot of cool stuff Oracle is definitely surfacing.
That's awesome. That's a really cool example, actually. I know there's like, there people can make the case that, well, there's apps that can do that too and stuff like that. But I can imagine, I think at the same time, like there's just all these opportunities for bots to create more personalized experiences and more specific cases. And there's a lot of cool ways that it can go. So definitely a great response to the thought process for enterprise. And so on that topic, actually a little bit is a question that I think you can answer pretty well, but I've actually heard not answered too well before in different articles and interviews before. And that's what is the best way to sell bots to businesses? And not necessarily, and it's a broad question, but you can touch upon like medium-sized businesses who are running websites, or like startups even who are running websites. Like, why can't they just have their own customer support people, right? Like how much time is it really saving? Or voice interfaces, recording a meeting. Like, do we really need anybody doing that, right? So, what is sort of your experience for the skeptics out there who just have no clue what the ROI can be?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a good question. I think first of all, I think there is a component of this that resides with the business that is trying to provide delivery for bots or is trying to create products for some use cases. I think first of all, I think in any emergent technology, there's definitely the tempting thing to do, which is let's try and address every use case in every vertical. So I think obviously, a first step is just go narrow, right?
Yeah.
Don't cater to the technology. Like a lot of people get, way too excited about the technology, and then we forget the business case.
Of course.
And, I'm not going to name any names, but, we certainly saw a couple of companies in the early days of bots, 2015, 2016, really hyping the technology and maybe hyping it a little too far and not really talking about the business case quite as much.
Yeah.
So I think this is just it's not atypical. I think it goes back to thinking about how we market all other types of technology, whether that's some sort of ERP solution or some sort of, chatbot or, a website, right? It's always really identifying what are the specific business needs and what are the upside benefits these companies can get access to. Now, specifically, if we're talking about some sort of like enterprise chatbot implementation, what we've seen success so far is, speaking to people in the sort of innovations departments or R&D departments in these companies, because they're sort of willing to experiment with some of these sort of more forward-leaning technologies. Certainly, we've also seen success, in the customer support sort of departments, because they sort of get it, and there's been a lot of talk and some high-profile successes in this space.
Sure.
But I would just say, it just goes back to, can you identify a pain point they have? Is the solution even a good fit? Because there's actually quite a few times where I've been talking to some of these business stakeholders, and I'm just saying, like, I see what you're saying, but I don't know if a chatbot or a voice user interface is actually going to be the best fit for what your challenge is.
Sure.
So, I think all those things, and then finally being able to say, okay, well, the chatbot is going to be able to address, 20% of these questions for the call center, and if your cost on average per call right now is between $6 and $7, let's say that we eliminated about 20% of these questions here. Now, what does that do to your overhead, right? How much more money are you saving? And then what's the upside for the end customer, right? Maybe that's, a higher NPS score and higher quality of customer support, because now you can sort of take those people that were working on the entire distribution of questions in the call center and push them only onto the calls that are the most complicated, right? Where the people are going to want to talk to a human. So, I think, that would be like my general suggestion about things is like, don't focus on the technology. Because quite honestly, like, no one cares about the technology, right? The technology is cool to guys like us,
that, of course.
Passionate about that. But, if you're a business owner or you're a stakeholder, you care about driving some sort of results or solving a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That, I guess it's always complicated for emerging tech, but, at the same time, like, I think that's I think influencers can make some of the biggest impact in that too. What are these people reading? What are they looking through on LinkedIn? They need to hear stuff like this. Also, of course, the people who are actually creating the products as well. But yeah, there were some, I would say there are some companies at the beginning who really, really sort of, I don't want to say messed it up, but sort of ruined it for a little bit in the way that they said it. And people are thinking, oh, bots are just these like, bots are just hype, rather than being legitimate ROI generating resources. So I guess that's what the next step is, right? Is sort of, coming out of what that image has been created. So on that note, let's jump into the bot community a little bit. Now, I personally have not been in the bot community too much in like the last couple of years. I remember being in the early days, again, 2015, 2016. I remember a lot of the cool discussions and a lot of the early publications and websites that were out there sort of facilitating a discussion. But you've had some communities that I haven't checked out before now, unfortunately. But you had your Facebook community, and you have your podcast, and you have an audience on LinkedIn as well. So just tell me a little bit about what are some of your big lessons from creating those communities? How did you sort of start in creating a community like that? What made you start a community rather than just be a writer or someone who's just writing posts or whatever, creating videos for that niche?
Yeah, I think it's very much in line with the same approach that I had with the podcast, right? Mm-hmm. I just think, the more people that we can bring together, we're all smart, right? In our ways, we're all smart, and we all can figure things out that are going to be valuable. But I think the aggregate of multiple people coming together and talking about these things, the net sum is always going to be more valuable, right? So to me, that's how I've always learned the fastest. So I took that same approach now, specifically with Botchapreneurs, the Facebook group. At the time, I didn't see very many people creating video content, and I saw 2 or 3 other guys that were doing some cool stuff. I ended up reaching out to them on LinkedIn. I said, hey, I think there's a cool opportunity for us to have a Facebook group and only to do video content, have video interviews, leverage that content and promote it and build an audience that was really engaged. And, so that was my approach with that. For our offline community that's actually out here in Seattle, we also run the chatbot and voice technology meetup. We scaled at 100 people. Same exact approach. And the nice thing too is if you create platforms, it provides people that are passionate to come and speak about that to audiences that are going to care about it. And because of that, we've been very, very fortunate to have people like the VP of Microsoft's AI and Research, Lily Chang, come speak. And we've had Suhas Uliar, the VP of bots over at Oracle, as well as like Cameron Williams, who's the developer evangelist at Amazon, come speak. And I've certainly learned many things about the ecosystem, best practices, and ultimately just trying to figure out how to create a community that's really engaged. As far as what things I've learned, I think probably the biggest thing I've learned is like, I think this is probably just like a good character to have in life in general, is just be humble, right? And I think having these, helping to be a part of facilitating these communities, has made me, because it showed me how much I knew, but also how much I didn't know. And I think the more people that we can bring together into these communities and really take that approach in learning, I think it just enables us to solve hard problems faster and to collaborate and to pool resources and to just really make things happen. Yeah. But that's what I guess I would say generally what I learned so far.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And on that topic a little bit more. So you were just at, it's called Chatbot Summit then, or Bot Summit, or which one?
Yeah, so it's called Chatbot Summit.
Chatbot Summit, yeah, gotcha.
They've done, I want to say they've done 4 events so far. So the first one was in Tel Aviv, and then the next one was in Berlin, and then they went back to Tel Aviv. I went there in January, and then I was just at the recent one in Berlin, and then they're going to be bouncing back to Tel Aviv in June.
Oh, nice. All right, so just out of curiosity, what do you think is sort of from that event? What is sort of the state of maybe it's probably brought out a lot of the international bot community, obviously,
sure,
overseas and everything. So it wasn't exclusive to the United States or to the North American region as well. So what's the status that you see, and sort of what is a very impactful moment from the event that you saw as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can. It's actually a topic I really enjoy talking about because, to me, it seems like there's a lot of sometimes confusion, a lot of noise in the space.
Sure.
You don't necessarily know sometimes if it's what you're hearing is actually real or if it's just marketing material. So, so my biggest takeaway is if we look at the hype cycle, at the first Chatbot Summit I went to earlier this year in January, they were essentially saying the hype is now over, which I pretty much agree with, and that we were sort of sitting in that trough of disillusionment, right? Mm-hmm. This in 2016, a very small set of implementations worked very well. Most of them failed, and now people sort of have a bad taste in their mouth, right? There were promises and commitments that just didn't come to fruition. But that being said, there was a ton of passion and a ton of interest and energy in building things that actually worked. Now, several months later, this previous Chatbot Summit in Berlin, the common sentiment was that we're beginning to climb out of that trough of disillusionment and begin to climb the slope of enlightenment, right? Now, obviously, these things are very, sometimes anecdotal if we think about the evidence. Some of it is quantitative. Now, I certainly believe that we are beginning to climb out of that slope, even if it's just on that initial incline.
Sure.
The reason why I believe that, the reason why I'm so confident in that is because, like a lot of the opportunity that was sold to people in the early days of the hype was 2 things. One is opportunity, paradigm shift, great. Second thing was AI is going to solve everything. NLP is so awesome. You can just all your data and put it into this platform and, you can ask it anything.
Yeah.
Reality check, right? It's like, that's just not the fact, right? So, from where that started to current day, now what is it that we see today, right? Sure, we still see some companies riding off of that, but also we see some select companies that have figured it out. Maybe they haven't cracked the entire piece, but they figured it out. So that to me begins to signal we are starting to identify best practices, turnkey models, heuristics, and I'll just name a couple of companies to sort of prove my point here.
Sure.
Well, actually, maybe I'll provide. Yeah, okay. I'll maybe provide this first example. So, when we think about Amazon, right? For example, Amazon probably has one of the largest teams when it comes to conversational user interfaces, data scientists, developers, UX experts, and anyone in between that.
Yeah.
Now, if you think about that, you would expect them to be releasing some sort of, ultra conversational, natural language understanding, implementation. That people are just like, oh, this is so crazy. This works great. But Amazon is realistic. Amazon is playing to the limitations of the ecosystem. So if you think about that, and then also think about Amazon has a customer support chatbot. Now their customer support chatbot is a rules-based chatbot. Just frame that for a second, right? For the people that have probably the most experienced team and the largest one, they have a rules-based chatbot, right? So what does that sort of tell us about the ecosystem right now? It means, people aren't riding off the hype anymore. They're beginning to curtail their expectations. They're curtailing the implementations. They sort of see what's working well, and they're pushing and focusing on the business case and the business outcomes, and not so much the technology anymore. So that's one example. The second example is there's a company called HelpShift. Now, HelpShift, they do sort of end-to-end customer support while leveraging chatbots. Now, I was talking to their co-founder, Abhinav Tripathi, and he was telling me that their platform now is processing over 900 million conversations per month, primarily facilitated by chatbots. Now, so they've also figured something out, and they took a very pragmatic approach as well, not overemphasizing using NLP for everything, but using NLP for certain components and the intelligence layer, and in addition to that, then using rule-based bots as well, right? Take a very pragmatic approach. And then there's companies like ShopMessage, which I mentioned, where they've also cracked something in the chatbot puzzle. And then there's another company called Bbot or Bespoke.ai, Japan, and they essentially are touching every 1 in 3 tourists, English speaking and Chinese speaking tourists, and that's 11 million people yearly. And I think that just goes to show that some people have figured out components of the ecosystem, and because of that, I think if we sort of measure that trend, we're slowly beginning to crawl out here. But it's certainly going to take a lot more insights and experience and failures as well as successes.
Absolutely.
I do see a lot of upside from that.
Yeah. That's a really good way to sort of, hear, I think, like for really anybody listening, whether they're into chatbots or not, I think it's just important that, hearing that there's an active, like there's examples of it coming back out, right? Especially when we talk about people who might be sort of skeptical of bots and curious about the future, hearing about like, yes, there are legitimate examples, there's legitimate ways it could come back, but it's just a matter of time and effort and sort of a community, obviously, that stays dedicated to it. So a little bit about audio interfaces. That one, if we want to talk about like chatbots, I mean, I guess, technically there's a few that have broken really well, right? I mean, I guess Alexa, right? That's something that I think, if we're talking about a centralized it depends on the definition of chatbots too, right? I'm not really sure. Sometimes people consider that maybe more towards, like chatting, right? Have to have text with it, and then there's audio bots or something like that. But what are your thoughts generally on, Alexa, sure, HomePod, Google Home, and their influence on, even if you can really briefly touch upon it, if you've seen cool examples in enterprise, because most of what we see is consumer. But yeah, what are your overall thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think if we think about from a technology perspective, primarily whether it's deployed on Messenger or Slack or voice interface like Alexa, for the most part, the technology is relatively similar. Although, like voice user interfaces, you have ASR, where you wouldn't even need that with a chatbot, right?
Sure.
That being said, with voice user interfaces, the channel doesn't exist, right? Mm-hmm. You could make the debate that it does exist for Google, because essentially every mobile handset is effectively a piece of that channel.
Exactly.
But with Amazon Alexa, right, that channel doesn't exist. So that you sort of see them coming out with like 30 devices. I think they released. They're trying to go gangbusters, when it comes to actually building out that channel. Now that being said, I definitely see chatbots are a bit more mature than voice user interfaces. I think voice user interfaces definitely have some significant obstacles to overcome.
Certainly.
The most glaring example of that right now is just the issue with discoverability, right? Discoverability, as well as, the intuitiveness of even finding that skill. So I think until that's really solved, I think voice is still going to continue to be sort of an adjunct channel, a primary touch point right now. So discoverability for sure.
Yeah.
And then extending that to the actual skills themselves. I think a lot of companies that have these skills built out, so I was just speaking with someone when I was actually in Berlin that had built out the BBC chatbot. The BBC Alexa skill, and they're doing some cool stuff with that. But like sort of a major thing right now is just like figuring out like what content is even going to resonate with people.
Sure.
Voice user interfaces, so that's certainly an opportunity that many people are trying to figure out. Like, okay, we have this user base already. Now, what content do they actually want to have over this, right? So I think that's definitely something that people are still focusing in on, right? So then if we even extend that to the opportunities to monetize, now, I think that's sort of the bottleneck, right? It's like if we don't really know right now what content's going to resonate on voice user experiences, we're going to have a difficult time sort of monetizing it, even though the monetization avenues exist with in-scale purchases as well as being able to charge people for subscriptions. I think voice certainly has some obstacles to overcome at this point. But seeing at the pace that Alexa and Google are releasing new devices, not only voice specific, but also multimodality based devices that also have the extension of screens or other interfaces, as well as a lot of the stuff they're pushing out to the developer community and providing accessibility for integrations. I think, within the next couple of years, we're definitely going to see some more interesting use cases. As far as a successful voice user interface skill right now that I can think of, that's actually a tough one, because for me, when I use voice user interfaces right now, typically it's just like flash briefings. And statistically, if you look at Amazon Alexa, that tends to be probably the most utilized feature at this point.
I'd say so, yeah.
That's a tough one, because it's like a lot of like the core components of some of these platforms, just asking what the weather is or asking,
play music.
Questions like that. Yeah, music, exactly. Seem to work very well. But, having those extended experiences from different brands, not so much so far. So I think there's obstacles to overcome right now.
Definitely. So yeah, great answer, and definitely good food for thought as well. Thinking about like where skills stand in sort of the realm of the chatbot community, chatbot world. I think that answers it that was sort of going to be my follow-up question, but I think you answered the status of that pretty well. So, and now we're down to our final questions, really. So, one of the last sort of more technical body questions here is, what do you think of, so you actually did touch upon it just like us for like a second, but, the big hype starting out was AI, NLP, a lot of different, pieces of technology, which language to use, which, like API to use, or a lot of different things for AI specifically, right? To do more of that stuff. But what do you think of sort of the world of like non-AI rather, conversational interfaces? Like,
sure.
Do you think that it's essential that we have only that's the only way to go? Or do you think there's still, a lot of opportunities for different ways to do it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think so. I come back to the context of, it depends. I guess that's like the running like consulting joke, right? It's like, it depends. It depends. Yeah. And I think it's like really identifying and aligning the specific use case with the flavor of chatbot per se. Whether that's a rule-based chatbot, whether that's a natural language processing only specific chatbot, or maybe whether that's a hybrid chatbot. And we're seeing a lot of hybrid chatbots within the ecosystem right now. And I think a lot of people don't give a lot of credit to the rule-based chatbots, something like Chatfuel or ManyChat.
Sure.
But in actuality, they're driving some significant business outcomes. The other day I was reading a case study where this rule-based bot on Chatfuel was driving like $100,000, $200,000 worth of revenue for this makeup company. And, I think that's certainly incredible.
Yeah.
As far as where technology is at right now, I think, NLP is pretty good. Content management and some of the intelligence layers are pretty decent. But, I think they can drastically be improved. I think for some specific compartmentalized use cases, they can work quite well. But I think there's a lot of very smart people working on solutions right now that are really interesting.
Yeah.
For example, I know a company right now, because context management is a pretty big pain in the ass right now, especially when you're building bots.
Yeah.
For you and I right now, just humans on this call, right? We can manage context quite easily. We know short-term and long-term.
Of course.
We can handle non sequiturs. So if we're talking about chatbots right now, and maybe we're talking about, maybe there's like some really good restaurant in San Francisco, easily jump back and we still have the context. Now,
right.
Most chatbots, even if it's a natural language processing chatbot, cannot handle non sequiturs, right? So those very basic, common things that take place in conversations that we have with our friends and family, most can't really handle.
Yeah.
Now, it is possible to try and handle those with some platforms, but the scalability and the amount of time necessary to build those experiences out oftentimes might not be the most practical way to go for things. So there are people working on making context management more accessible. There's a company I'm into called Before.ai. Michael Furtick is actually sort of a big champion of them. I think he's the CEO of it right now and also was one of the initial investors. They're certainly doing some cool stuff in that space. They're building sort of a model called stacking to handle context management. I found it to be quite practical, and they have a really impressive tech demo. So definitely make sure to check them out. And then also Oracle is doing a lot of cool stuff, whether that's sequence stuff, whether that's knowledge graphs, whether that is transfer learning. They have aspects of all of that in their current platform right now. And to be honest, I think they probably have one of the most advanced platforms when it comes to sort of the AI related chatbots and implementations. But, that being said, I'll sort of come back to what I initially said. It's, there are benefits and downsides and examples of each of these different flavors working well in a variety of different use cases. It really just depends on the use case.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, that's a great way to close it out. I think that was sort of that's a good sort of talk about, or good thing to think about the future, right? Good to think about the next steps of what the world of chatbots might look like, the world in technology, in, practicality, stuff like that. So this was great. Thank you so much for joining us, Chad, today. And just wanted to ask, final question is, where can we find you right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you guys are in Seattle, definitely come out to the Chatbot and Voice Technology Meetup. We're actually working with Live Person right now. So they just put in a new research and development center out here in Seattle. We're going to have Alex Spinelli come and speak. So he's the new CTO of Live Person. He was actually the head of Alexa OS at Amazon.
Oh, wow.
Jumped shipped a couple of months ago. So he'll definitely have some really interesting things to talk about. Mm-hmm. Also, I'll be dropping more podcasts on the Bot Podcast. We recently had interviewed Ofer Ronen from Google. And then I'm going to be dropping a podcast with Rob Lawson, who's also from Google, who's working on their RBM RCS initiative.
Nice.
There. Also, feel free to join our Botchapreneurs group on Facebook. We certainly help to foster a lot of conversations, fireside chats. So it's a good place to sort of get connected to people in the space. Also, always feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. More than happy to, talk, chat, introduce you to people in the space. I'm always willing to do that. And then, if you guys are looking for, me at other conferences, I'm going to be speaking at the Business of Bots conference in February of next year.
Nice. Well, thank you so much again. To the audience quickly, thank you so much for joining us today. I think this has been a really, really great perspective on the status of bots, the bot community, the future of bots even, and just sort of just some really, really good food for thought in, not just for a certain niche, but for really, consumer enterprise, small business, B2B, all that stuff. So yeah, perfect. Thanks so much. And tune in for our next interview coming out soon.
Cool. Thanks so much, Nikhil.